Hi everyone, today we're going to be rendering a retro camera in accordance with activity 10, I think, in week 7. So if we just look at the video at the moment, what I'm doing at this point is just setting up the basic massing of the design. We're going for a box style camera, 1920s sort of circa, and I've decided that I was going to do two low viewpoints to give a sense of scale to the design, make it a little bit more interesting. And to kick off, we're just getting the overall geometric solid that the design fits in, the big box that if you were to put it in a package, how the camera would neatly fit. Then progressively what we're doing is looking at the secondary design details, and you can see there I've got a double lens structure, one on top of the other, fits inside a square in each case, so we've masked out the square, bisected the diagonals. We have a cube there sitting in space, or a rectangular prism sitting in space. We've bisected the diagonals, and that gives us the guide points for the ellipse. What we're doing at this point is just adding in some secondary details around that main lens structure, just sketching in with construction lines at this stage. And for your interest, I use a Faber-Castell Polychroma Indiana blue. It seems to work quite well for me because it's a wax-based pencil. There's very little graphite which gets transferred onto the page, so for me as a left-hander it keeps the page relatively clean, and the construction lines fade into the background when I'm doing a concept sketch when I apply marker over the top. So you can see we're getting that main camera masked out at this stage. I keep it fairly fluid, and the critical thing in terms of perspective is I let my eye be the judge. So I put some construction lines on the page. I review the line work as a work in progress, and if I see the need to make any adjustments, I just push and pull the line work in order to give me a workable solution. So it's a fairly fluid approach. Progressively work myself across the drawing, working from the big problems to the small problems. So I've done the front face, which is going to be the visual focus of the design. Now I'm doing the top and return face, which is going to have less detail on it. Just massing out those surfaces there, refining some of the line work, particularly on the ellipses. And you can see we've got a primary hero shot in the view, and then the secondary image on the right hand side will be looking at the camera from behind. And because we want the eye to be drawn progressively across the drawing, just simply by virtue of scale, I create a sense of depth in the drawing by simply making that right hand rectangular prism smaller and rotating it onto a different angle so it's got a little bit of interest in it. I've roughly masked out the shadows, so when I come to the rendering stage, everything's in place. So there's the back face coming into view. Because it's in the background, less detail is required, so I'm just a little bit more fluid with the line work. Serial plate on the back, trying to think about details that bring the design to life and create a little bit of interest. Pardon me. This part took about, if I recall, about 20 minutes to get to that stage. Now I'm moving into the line work stage, so I'm taking a typical additive and subtractive form approach. So my workflow is going from construction lines to a polished line drawing, and then finally to the rendering stage. Now this isn't the only way that we can work with Copics. In fact, it can be quite successful to work with as a tonal study to begin with. So you do most of the line work with the Copics at the start, and if you're doing rapid iteration design and you want just a rough sketch, sometimes this can be a faster and more interesting way to look at the design process. But in this case, we want it to be a little bit more polished, so I've opted to go with a line work drawing up front. So we're working out the structure as a series of geometric solids. Now you should be able to see a variety of line types occurring in this sketch. So I'm working with two particular pens so they can be seen on screen. Typically I work with a Pilot High-Tech V for fine line work, but in order for it to be seen on video I opt for two middleweight pens, a Staedtler Permanent Lumicolor in extra fine and an Artline 210 for my heavier line work and profile lines. So I'm working with the Staedtler Lumicolor pen there at the moment to get the internal details for the design lines, refining the construction as I go along, so I don't slavishly just copy the construction lines. I use the construction lines just as a foundation. Refining things as I move along. You'll notice that I turn the page to suit the direction of my hand rather than move around the drawing. That way I can maintain a little bit more line control. Building the lens structure now with a little bit more detail. For the most part, although I'm maintaining a consistent line thickness, I'm trying to maintain thinner lines on the lit side of the object, which is the side I'm working on at the moment, and thicker lines on the shaded side of the object. I have a light source that's going to be coming from the upper right hand side on this image, such that the lit face will be the primary face of the design, the side with the camera lenses on it, and the return face will be in shadow. Bringing out the detail, and quite often it's the detail on the drawing which for the most part can be hidden in many respects, but it also brings the drawing to life. So if it was just a square box with two round cylinders plugged on it, it would look a little bit dead as a drawing, but the gestural line work on your image, which gets details like chamfers and parting lines and mechanisms and control surfaces, all of those are part of the fun part of the drawing, which activates the image and makes it believable as a 3D visualization. So you can see there's a little parting line on that section there, so we want to convey it as being recessed, so we've just put a second line on it, coming back around and just putting a profile line for the time being to finish off that part of the sketch. And we're pretty well done on the line work stage for the left hand image, the main image on the page. Just building up some of the line work on a few of the surfaces. Working out the background plate. And this is a good example of where we're thinking on the fly. So if we get a decision which doesn't work for us, I'm using the sketch as a work surface. So you can see I modified the background plate a couple of times there and dragged it down in size. Now we're just lining in roughly the rear face of the design. Because it's in the background, less detail, generally lighter line work. And we try and keep a consistent level of sketchiness in the design, so you notice I haven't used a ruler to rule everything in, so I can work a little bit more quickly. I can keep it as a loose concept sketch. Focusing on that backplate detail, trying to get the sense of fillets and chamfers, so if there's a curved surface on the design, okay, we're pretty well finished the line work stage of the drawing. And you can see it's looking about right at this stage. Adding a few fine point details where the horizon line is going to be on the lens. And now we're moving into the rendering stage. So it's all going to be done pretty much all with cool grey markers. I'm laying in a base wash of cool grey 3 just to give myself some sense of tonal value on the lens, which is going to be the principal focus. Dropping in cool grey 5, and cool grey 7. Now, the important thing to remember from your Copic rendering prac in class is that you practice 3 basic skills with marker: flat washes, graded washes, and hopefully the simple little streaked wash might have been explained as well. So you can divide up a 3-dimensional surface into a lit face, a front face, and a return face, and as long as you apply those wash types in a consistent fashion such that you have tonal values reflecting the lit face, the front face, and the return face of the design, you can generally work out a pretty good rendering solution. So you can see we're working for the most part with cool grey 3s and cool grey 5s on the front face, and on the lens, which is highly reflective, I've gone to a cool grey 7 and a little bit of black. It's a black body camera, so we're coming back in and getting a mix of cool grey 3 and cool grey 5. Working from the big problems to the small problems. So in this particular case, I want to get the front of the design looking right. Once I've got the balance right on that, then it's a relatively easy exercise to render in the return face of the design, which in this case is on the left hand side of the image, such that it balances and gets contrast with the front face. So you can see, hopefully the base wash is going in first. I figure out the basic tonal value or the diffused value of that part of the design, and then I work out the primary shadows on the big surfaces, and then progressively build out and get the secondary shadows. So where there's a knob or a chamfer or an edge to the design, there's generally a second shadow which casts itself on the design, so it will push details backwards and forwards depending upon how you put shadows against each other. So you can see on that little portion there, by putting a fairly strong black shadow on that top portion, it pushes the right hand side forward. Doing some fine point details with the black. And now we're moving on to the second view. As we move into the background, the contrast drops down, the amount of detail, surfaces become desaturated. In this particular case, that's not so important because there's no colour on the drawing, it's basically a grey image. Getting the base tones in first, trying to keep things relatively simple and not overworking the drawing. A little bit of gestural detail here and there, but not smothering it in colour all over the place. the lens on the back there. Now that's the shaded face of the design, so it's important to remember that we need to be consistent in our light source. So if we have an object on the page which has the light coming in from the upper right hand side, then when we draw the second image on the page, it's by far the best idea to maintain the same light source. So the lit faces, or the front face of the design in this case, are always on the right hand side of this image. Also, if you're doing a multiple sheet presentation, it also is in your best interest to maintain that logic as well. So if you have a 3-sheet presentation, having all of your light sources coming in from the upper right hand side maintains a consistency of presentation on your images. Once we've got the base tones in, we just work in a little bit of additional detail to pop details where we want the eye to be drawn. Ground shadow to connect it to the surface of the page. Looking alright at this stage. Just review it every so often and don't be too precious about the work. In order to create a ground surface for it to stand on, I'm just throwing in a gestural reflection in the surface of the page using a cool grade 3. Now because it's a reflective surface, I'm getting a pastel based pencil, a Carbothello pencil, and adding sky tones and earth tones. So just stereotypically a brown tone where it's reflecting the ground, and an earth tone where it's a sky tone where it's reflecting the sky. So you can see how that simple gesture activates the lens and makes it look a little bit exciting and engaging. Now adding a little bit of texture to the surface there. I've got a bottle of colourless blender, so that's just effectively alcohol. There's no pigment in it. Getting a little chucks, dampening the cloth and adding a little bit of detail in order to create a textural effect. So it saves us having to draw every single detail, and we've got a sort of mottled surface now that looks like leather or marble or whatever detail you want. Coming back in and on the shaded side of the object, just sculpting out those profile lines a little bit more. Coming back in with a Copic black and an Artline 210 helps us clean up the design, checking our shadows a little bit. Doing the background plate now. And here we're adding a little bit of colour. It's a fairly neutral presentation, so I've kept my colour application also fairly subdued, so we're using a blue-grey back plate. I don't want the eye to be drawn too much away from the product, so I'm keeping the saturation relatively consistent between the design and the background plate. Trying not to be too precious, just keeping it crisp here and there, but there's a loose sort of feel to it because I want it to still appear conceptual in nature. Typical refinements, making things look crisp, adding product identification to the design, little dark spots of shadow in there, just refining the ground shadow in a little bit and adding a few spot highlights on the lit side of the product, except one or two on the left hand side. Final touches, Oop. Looking good. So in this particular case, we've sort of stepped beyond the concept sketch type presentation, but the basic skills remain the same. So it's a sort of high-end concept sketch. So it would be the type of sketch when you're getting towards the end of the concept stage and you're trying to pin down or sell a particular proposal, but it's still loose and fluid. Sharpening up those reflections in the lenses. Always a few final touches that need to be done. Looking pretty good at this stage. Remember to add notations to your submissions, so you're practicing your hand lettering skills, and it forms part of the graphic presentation. Excellent. Well, I hope this was useful to everyone, and I look forward to seeing your submissions fairly soon. All right, all the best.